Absolutely. And the one artist we did cover previously was Katie Lang.
Yep.
And we're going to be doing, as we've decided, Ingenue here for
Yes.
1992, as opposed to we covered her debut, Shadowland, earlier in the 80s as well. And we were all pretty high on that album and kind of said she had that Elvis meets country feel to it. And then she made an album that had the words torch and twang in it, so it continued.
Yep.
And then, Josh, we got this one, and I was waiting for the torch and the twang, and I got Sade instead of this album, and I got good Sophistopop,
Oh
but
yeah.
it was a Sophistopop album, so it was like a little bit of Sade meets a little bit of uh, Roxy Music, and
Hmm.
just different people along the way. But definitely, the first thing that popped up is like, whoa, this is the thing this shares the most in common with this Sade album. And I was familiar with Constant Craving, which is a really excellent single. I've
Yep.
always liked that song. I like it lyrically. I love the way it sounds. It's also the last track on the album, which
I know.
I would have thought for sure it would have been the first track, but no, it's sitting there at the end, closing the album, which is an interesting placement for it. But I think once I kind of got over the shock that it was nothing like what I was expecting, I listened to it a second time, and then I kind of did a little bit of homework because I was curious. And it sounds like this was like a conscious decision that was made for Katie Lang to sort of step away from sort of the country world. I guess a combination of feeling like, the standards and she was singing standards, right? But she was also
Hmm.
singing country songs. I think she just felt like it had gotten to the end of what she could do with that. And also she had been doing things like she'd come out as a lesbian
Hmm.
at this point and stuff, and kind of was like, I want to, maybe be in a space that allows me to explore some of that stuff, and country or standards might be a little harder. But it is an interesting choice to, in that lane, go to Sophistopop. You would think it would be like, this is like the era, because this album's a little earlier than some of the albums we covered. So this is 92, right? You would think
Hmm.
she'd go full on singer songwriter, kind of like lean into it, maybe even something like we've seen with like a Tori Amos or a Ani DeFranco or something like that. No, this is sort of like, I'm going for radio airplay for an adult audience. And so then I start looking like, what's the age? And the age is like early 30s here. So she isn't past that point. Were you as surprised as I was, Josh, that this is the album you got?
Oh yeah. Yeah, and you said we were all high on Shadowland. I was as well. That is, I looked back at my rankings, and that is in the elite category of the cold listens. I'm doing the rankings slightly different nowadays, following your rubric, but back then, I rated that album pretty highly. And yeah, this is how you do adult contemporary, right? This
Mm-hmm.
in some ways,
Yep.
it is timeless. This song, there are so many different, I feel like, influences and instruments on this album that it really had forced me to like listen carefully to kind of dial in what I was hearing and what it was pulling from. It's anchored by her voice, which continues to impress me. I also was, like you said, I was expecting another country album or some sort of spin on that, and this is not. There is maybe one song that feels slightly country, but for the most part, she is, I feel like, drawing on some Latin sounds, some maybe like Italian, some jazz, some
Some ethereal sounds like
yep,
The Mind of Love.
mm-hmm, yep, and complex arrangements throughout as well. She really uses her voice well throughout this. She's got, I would say, dozens of different instruments. You've got, from steel guitar,
Marimbas.
lap steel, yeah, marimbas, accordions, different types of violins. I think there's a clarinet on Season of Hollow Sound, which has this really like smoky jazz club feel to it, and this like big like stand-up bass, and really, you know, it's all of a piece. I feel like it all kind of feels like her when she's singing, but every song is a little bit different. Miss Chantelane, which I think was a single besides Constant Craving, has this like Latin beat to it with an accordion and violins that transition into this like up-tempo song, and it really highlights, lets her voice shine too. She can really belt it out, and I'm always impressed by that. And Still Thrives This Love has this like waltz beat to it, with strings, and she somehow makes it all work. She seems to be able to kind of mold anything to what she wants to do, and it's really impressive. Constant Craving was the one song I heard that I alluded to that I knew. I felt like that song was everywhere. I think it won a Grammy for Song of the Year too, or single, or whatever album of the, I can't remember what they use as their single for the year.
Record of the year.
Record of the year. Yeah. But yeah, that's the one that people will recognize. But even that song has a complexity that I did not pick up on when you hear it on the radio, and really doesn't sound quite like anything else on this album either. So it's not, you can't really, this is a true representation of the value of listening to an album too, as opposed to like just picking out the best Katie Lang tracks on Spotify or something. This really kind of puts, I feel like, her mindset of where she was at a time and place, and these songs on this album cohere and work really well together, even though they're different from track to track.
Yeah, I agree. And it's I'd said Sade is the bar, but then there's songs like Tears of Love's Recall that, who that reminds me of is Nina Simone a little bit. There's a little bit of that wistful, sultry sort of sound, with a lot floating under the surface, but also I used Authority to talk about the OC, right? In the last, or OC, I should say, the way he raps, and he kind of gets your attention. But I feel the way she sings on some of these songs with complex arrangements, but also arrangements that the complexity is sort of the underlying part of it, right? It's not right out in the front. It allows the space for her voice to live. And I was always a big Nina Simone person. And so anything where I say this reminds me a little bit of Nina Simone, that's a huge compliment for me. And I think you're right. I think this represents, I've been higher on adult contemporary than you guys have been. There's been, a fair amount of stuff that I've enjoyed, gone from, moderately enjoyed to enjoyed quite a bit. But this is probably my favorite example of something that is primarily made for mainstream adults, right? In the sense of it's not really the sound that hits your 16-year-old ear, but you grow into this sound. So thumbs up, and impressive that Katie Lang can make an album like Shadowland in 1988 and then 4 years later make an album so very different as this album. It's kind of a different way of doing standards, isn't it? Like, she was doing sort of like country and western rock and roll standards in 88, and then in 92 she's doing standards, but more of like like ballads almost, and old school R&B, type sounds. So soul.
I think it really seems like an omnivore in what she's able to pull from influences, or what she's interested in using musically. And to your point, like, she continues always kind of evolving, because I think later on she does a record with Tony Bennett too, right? And
she does,
which is well regarded, and she's always kind of in that space, and she seems to be
which
able
makes sense, because he does nothing but sing standards.
Right.
Her two albums have the one unifying thing has been that she sort of sings standards, on both. So it makes sense that the king of the standards, Tony Bennett, would be with her.
But yeah, I was really impressed by this one, and the adult contemporary just means, like, not complexity, but there's a maturity here that I think, like you said, you don't appreciate until you're older, or if you're like a music fan, you'll pick up on a lot of the kind of complexities or subtleties in this album. So yeah, it's highly
Youth
recommended.
rewards bombast, and this is not
Right.
something that gives bombast. This is something, it doesn't give you like catchy choruses or
Hmm.
big parts. It's more, it's just there, and it presents itself, and you go and meet it, right? So
Yep.
I like that about it, and yeah. Even though when I heard Constant Craving as a teenager, I liked it immediately, and I remember my dad playing the hell out of this album,
Oh,
and
really?
I laughed because when my dad was playing the hell out of this album, he was roughly the same age as I was now. You know what I mean? It's like, okay, well, this makes a lot more sense now since I enjoyed this. But yeah, I could definitely remember hearing this album. There was a period, there was a good, month or two where this was in my dad's rotation of stuff that he would play in the evening, especially like evening music for him, and it makes sense because it is good evening music.
Yeah, it is good evening music, and you're right. Just to clean the stack, that is how you spell ingenue. That's how you pronounce it, and I just never seen it in
Finally, I
print
didn't
before.
mispronounce something.
I guess.
Yeah,
Yeah. But yeah,
yeah,
high recommend for this one.
yep. And yeah, this week, pretty. I liked all three albums this week. So I was impressed.